unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Ruth Whippman, who is a journalist and author of two books that I have here. One, the recent book called BoyMom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. And this one from a couple of years back, it's called America the Anxious, How Our Pursuit of Happiness is Creating a Nation of Nervous Wrecks. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
You know, I saw a bit of a continuity in these books, right? Because in the first book, you talk about how America's obsession with happiness and the pursuit of happiness has sort of rendered people nervous wrecks. And there seems to be a correlation between the extent to which people are obsessed with happiness and their lack of happiness. And a lot of it is rooted in the notion that so much of it is within the control of individuals, right? And that it's not a product, your happiness, your well-being is not a product of circumstance or genetics. It's really due to your own actions. And, you know, when I was reading the book, BoyMom, I detected a bit of that anxiousness in you, right? Because it seemed like you were being told by everybody that every decision you made with respect to parenting had very high stakes, and that, you know, you were responsible in many ways for the sculpting of your boys' values and your boys' personalities and so forth. And you know, it was up to you to either reinforce or fight whatever dominant norms there were in the culture. I mean, it was the motivation of the book. I mean, it seems like this idea that, you know, it's up to you, right, to create these wonderful boys.
Yeah, this is such an interesting comparison, and no one's actually drawn that comparison yet between the two books. But now you say it, it is so evident. But I think it just almost became, you know, we moved from the UK 11 years ago. And so America the Anxious was very much about bringing this British woman moving to the US, seeing all those trends and sort of really feeling like an outsider in terms of this like control piece. Yeah, in terms of this, like, the more effort you put into your own happiness, the better results you're going to get, this kind of one for one thing. But I think now it's just kind of the water that I swim in. So it wasn't like an ideological starting point that I thought, oh, this would make an interesting book to write about boys and masculinity and parenting and all the rest of it. It's just now something that I've internalized, I think, as a mother, that, you know, that there is this very direct link between how much effort you put in, you know, with your kids and the results that you're going to get. And it's a very stressful conceit. And it's really interesting that you're pointing it out, because now I'm kind of seeing that in myself for the first time in a way.
Well, but it's only now that so much of it is believed to be up to us, not only as parents, but even for kids themselves. You know, no one 50 years would ask a child, okay, so, you know, what gender do you want to be, right? But now, I mean, we're asking kids to create themselves, define themselves. We're thrusting a lot of responsibility onto them because so much is sort of, you know, in play. And I think it's due to a consensus, maybe not, I don't know if it's pervasive everywhere, but certainly there's a consensus in certain circles that, you know, so much is due to nurture and not nature, right? Including the things that we want and the ways that we behave, right? There's this belief that nurture is everything, right?
Yes. And I absolutely, I think there is this, you know, you're right. It's both what we expect of parents and what we expect of kids. But in some way, it's this kind of false idea of choice. You know, I think with kids, you know, there's this sort of superficial idea that you can just choose whatever gender you are, you can just choose whatever. But actually, there's so much invisible cultural baggage going on in the lives of kids and in adults with what we're all doing in terms of gender, all the invisible things and baggage that we bring to this project. So even though we think we're acting with our complete free will and, you know, making these choices, actually a lot of these choices are really decided for us anyway. Before you've, you know, that's just the cultural piece. Before you've even got to the the nature piece, the biological piece of it. And they're also linked in together, that I think we're operating with this idea that we have this huge amount of control over all of these things. And I think both culturally and biologically and, in all kinds of different ways, we have far less control than we think we do.
Now, you said that you were raised by a very feminist mom who was basically telling you that you had the ability to choose, right? Your norms. She was very discouraging about, pink colors, and, girls' toys and so forth.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that there was definitely a certain wave of feminist mothering, right? I guess you would call it, that you
Yes.
were schooled in. And I think you expected when you became a parent that you would carry on that tradition, but then you were given boys, right? And so I mean,
Yes.
did you have, before you had children, did you have some notion of what you were going to do? I mean, did you have a vision of carrying on, like, feminist motherhood with these boys?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I just kind of assumed that I would have girls. I'm one of two girls. I was raised in this feminist household. I went to an all-girls school. So girlhood was what I knew. And I think there's something psychologically easier in this moment about I'm going to raise my daughter to be strong and to reach for the stars and to take up space and all of these kinds of positive messages, rather than I'm going to raise my son to not be a jerk, not be an asshole, not be, it's a lot of negatives, to take up less space, to have less power, to have, to be small in the world. And so I think, and especially in the context that we're talking about of American parenting norms, which is just, we're all trying to create the best, most successful, the most this, the most that, the most stellar child at some level. That's the kind of expectation of modern privileged American parenting. So there was this disconnect, with the cultural narratives around raising boys. And I think I just was not prepared psychologically for the task of raising boys, either in terms of what they were like, or in terms of what was kind of expected of me to do.
Yeah, I mean, I find it interesting that the change in the way we raise girls is about giving them the ability to adopt these masculine identities or masculine norms, whereas the change in the way in which we raise boys, it's not so much that we're offering an additional set of norms, like, oh yeah, by the way, you can too be a house husband, right? I mean, you see girls wearing shirts like,
Right. And
I don't have to be a princess, I can be an astronaut, but we don't see shirts for boys saying I don't have to be an astronaut, like I can be in, a prince or whatever.
a nurse or something. Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. I think that it becomes this circular problem because as a culture, we tend to value what men value. That's sort of built into the idea of patriarchy. So male concerns are given a higher cultural value. So it feels like aspirational for a girl to want to be, a Supreme Court justice or a scientist or a sports star or all the rest of it. But we devalue attributes associated with girls and women. So empathy, nurturing, relational skills, those sorts of things. And so it feels like a demotion. There's something almost emasculating about saying to a boy, you can be anything a girl can be. Whereas if you say to a girl, you can be anything a boy can be, it sounds like aspirational. Whereas that sort of like, to a boy, it feels like a step down. And I think it really cuts to the heart of what we actually value as a society, this gender piece to it. So yeah, I think it is, there's something really tricky as a parent. Like, what are you trying to do? I think before you can encourage boys to take on those more feminine coded attributes, you have to truly believe that those attributes have value. But I do believe that boys are genuinely missing out. I do believe that those feminine coded values have huge worth and are hugely important for our psychological well-being and for living a happy, healthy life. And so I feel like this project of realizing that boys and men are losing out in this system is a really big part of what we need to do here.
Yeah, you also mentioned that you were surprised by the discovery that boys might require more parenting or more
Yes.
maternal care than girls, right? Because I think the
Yeah.
general
I mean,
sense is, yeah, just let them go do their thing and, play in the yard, so to speak.
yeah. I mean, I think there's this kind of cultural narrative, which is like, I hear this phrase a lot. I've got 3 boys, and I always hear, boys are like dogs, just feed them, send them out in the yard, take them to the park, throw a ball at them occasionally. That's all they need. They're simple creatures. And, boys will be boys. It's this idea that, they're maybe a little rambunctious, a little destructive, but they're not like emotionally complex in the way that girls are emotionally complex. And so I think the idea, the boys will be boys thing is just kind of like, oh, shrug your shoulders, let them get on with it. But when I started digging into the research on this, what I found was actually the opposite is true. Boys are born more emotionally vulnerable than girls and more emotionally sensitive, and they need more care, more input from their caregivers, if anything. So a baby boy at birth, his brain is about a month to 6 weeks behind a baby girl's brain in right brain development. So that's the part that deals with emotions, emotional self-regulation. So the ability to calm down if you're distressed or upset, forming the attachment bond, that kind of thing. And a baby girl's brain is slightly more mature, slightly more resilient. She can be a bit more independent. So girls cry a little bit less, they calm down more easily, these sorts of things. So boys need a little more support from their caregivers in that way, a little more nurturing. But when you look at both the kind of cultural narratives and the data on this, boys actually get slightly less nurturing parenting as a group than girls do. We touch boys in different ways. They get less of that kind of nurturing, caretaking touch than girls do. We talk to them less about their feelings. We give them less attentive care in many ways. There's all these sort of observational studies. There's population studies that show that boys are more likely to receive physical punishment, hostile parenting, and so over time, this adds up. It's this, they need a little more, they get a little less, and that compounds and compounds and compounds into something quite unhealthy over time.
Yeah, I mean, why do you suppose that we sort of neglect that? I mean, we put a lot of emphasis on the Trumps of the world, right? They're the ones that are in the news, and the Johnny Depps, and so male privilege is on full display. But the higher suicide rates and the higher depression rates and the shorter life expectancy and all the different disorders. I mean, that doesn't seem to get as much press.
Attention. Yeah. So I think we've sort of settled into this narrative that's very oversimplistic, this kind of privileged and oppressed. It's this binary. And maybe that maps well onto certain dynamics, maybe more like racial dynamics. But in this gender piece, it doesn't actually, that very simple patriarchy benefits men and harms women, or men are privileged and women are oppressed. It doesn't actually, it's the reality is way more complex than that. And this is very different than the kind of like men are the real victims, like narrative of the right. It's just that patriarchy harms men and boys too. It comes with built-in harms, and they're not kind of incidental harms. They're written into the script. So men benefit absolutely in terms of power, but they lose out in terms of things like intimacy, emotionality, human connection. So when we're talking about, emotional skills, relational skills, it's actually men that are kind of the oppressed group in a way. And so I think because we're thinking about it in such a simple way, when people say, oh, boys are struggling in school, or, male suicide rates are higher, it's almost like the progressive left finds it really hard to genuinely care about that. I think it's become this right-wing coded issue, anything to do with boys and men. And I think there's a way in which, we all learned in our gender studies class in college that patriarchy harms men too, but it's like we've kind of forgotten it and just proceeded as if that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. Now, you actually went and did some field research, and you went to one of these masculine behavioral therapy camps, right? I mean,
Yeah.
as somebody from Berkeley, I mean, you must have seemed like a someone from another planet when you stepped into this place.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think masculine behavioral therapy is like pushing it a little bit. It was a residential therapy center for boys. I think now they accept girls and young women as well, but at the time it was for boys and young men who had this like failure to launch phenomenon. So, you hear about it in the news, this idea that boys and men are not going to college at the same rates as girls and women. They're not getting jobs. They're in their parents' basement, like watching porn and playing video games. So this was a kind of residential therapy center, and the guy who ran it, who was a social worker, his belief was that what boys needed was more masculine input, more masculinity. Whereas I think, I was coming at it from the place of like, well, maybe all this masculinity is part of the problem rather than the solution. But what was really interesting about this place was although all the rhetoric was about masculinity, so he kept talking about it. It was like, they need to be more masculine. We need masculine role models, masculinity. That word was said all the time. But the actual substance of what they were doing there was almost kind of the opposite. It was like all about relationship building and empathy and these kind of more nurturing soft skills, building community. It was actually this like lovely place where they had, this lovely kitchen where the boys could hang out and make grilled cheeses and talk about their feelings. And they had all these groups where they would share their emotions. And so it's like, it was this real disconnect. It's like, in what way is this masculinity? And I think it was almost like they had to brand it as masculinity to allow themselves to enjoy it, or to, as long as they could sort of justify it to themselves that it was masculine, then they could kind of proceed with all this other stuff. And so, yeah, it was a really interesting experience. I actually have a lot of admiration and respect for the guy who was running it. He was doing a great job. They were really like making a difference in these boys' lives. It was just like why they had to call this masculinity was, a little odd.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we have a very stereotypical view of masculinity. I'm not sure it would be recognizable to everyone throughout history, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you said something. Is this a product of marketing? Like GI Joe toys and stuff like that. I mean, that we have such a narrow
Yeah. Well,
understanding of what that is.
yeah. So, I mean, the GI Joe toys phenomenon is actually really fascinating. It's something that I found out in the course of my research that GI Joe, the figure back in 1960, if you look at a picture of him, he's just this like regular guy. He just like his body shape is just really sort of ordinary looking. But sorry, excuse me. I got sorry, let me put my do not disturb. My apologies. Sorry. Do you want me to start that again?
Yeah, just start again.
Okay, sorry about that. So GI Joe is a really interesting phenomenon. The figures, the toy figures. If you look at the version of him from the 1960s, he just looks like this kind of regular guy. He doesn't even have defined abs. He's just like, someone's Uncle Bill from whatever. But if you see those kind of action figures now, GI Joe or any of these like toys that little kids play with, they have these huge muscles, these like super hyper masculine, hyper muscled physiques. It's ramped up and ramped up and ramped up. And we hear a lot, or I certainly heard a lot about, Barbie or Bratz dolls having this body shape that was really unattainable for a human woman, and the way that was playing into girls like body image disorders and and sort of body shame. But I think we haven't really had the same understanding of what this is doing to boys. It's not just the dolls or the action figures. It's in the movies. It's the CGI superheroes. The ideal body shape for boys and men has just like grown and grown and grown, as the ideal body shape for women has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk into nothingness. And so I think this is giving today's boys and men a really unattainable idea of like what manhood, what masculinity is, almost a kind of cartoonish vision of what masculinity means.
But I mean, do you think that this is part of a broader trend around status insecurity? I mean, it does seem like, there's been this rise of incels. I mean, obviously they're a bit extreme. They're the ones that get attention on the internet, but marriage rates are lower. Marriage ages are higher. The sexual activity is lower. I mean, we do have a huge generation of young males that are not finding partners, not finding, mates, probably
Yeah.
don't have any prospect of ever finding a partner or a mate. I mean, this is a relatively recent phenomenon, at least compared to, say, our parents' or grandparents' generation.
Yeah. Yes. So I spent some time as part of my research, I wrote a whole chapter on the incel movement. And I don't know how familiar your listeners are with that group, but incel stands for involuntary celibate, is this young men generally who want to be having sex, who want to have a girlfriend or a partner, but they can't. And they generally identify as short or unattractive or undesirable in some way. And there's a huge range of views actually within this group, but like at its worst, this group is misogynistic. They blame women for everything. They can be racist, white supremacists, like every toxic
And
trend
some of them
you can
become
imagine.
killers, right? Some of them become murderers,
Right, and yes, and at its fringes, this group has been associated with horrific mass violence. So a lot of the school shooters or mass shootings that we've heard about are carried out by either incels or kind of incel adjacent type. We know this character, the school shooter, who's like lonely, he's isolated, he's usually, friendless, resentful. And then, you see these manifestos written by these guys. So not all incels are school shooters, but it's a definite section of the group. And you can see on their message boards that they glorify these guys. They see themselves as really unsuccessful in general schemes of masculinity. And then I think that the extremes, the school shootings, are often this kind of grotesque, cartoonish attempt to reclaim some masculine power and status. There's something about just getting a gun and killing a bunch of people. It's this identification with this alpha male, this superhero, this sort of stereotype that has been fed to boys and men really since childhood, since birth. This is who you should be. And then this gap between who they really are and that ideal. So this group is fascinating in many ways. And I spent a lot of time on their message boards. They're repulsive places in many ways. But at the same time, there's this weird paradox, which is these guys on their forums are also incredibly emotionally vulnerable and sharing of feelings and tender towards each other and showing a lot of emotional support for each other in a way that is very hard for men and boys to achieve in real life. It's almost because they felt like they couldn't really participate in general systems of masculinity because they were right at the bottom of the hierarchy. They were just hopeless. They'd given up. It was almost freeing in some weird way that they could just then go and be really vulnerable with each other in a way that most men feel they really can't do if they want to maintain their masculine status. So this group is full of paradoxes. And yes, I think they say a lot about our wider culture, both in terms of this hyper online way that we're all living. We're spending so much time on screens, about mounting loneliness, about masculinity expectations and how unattainable they feel for most men, about the rise and success of women and the kind of normalization of misogyny. It's just all these themes are there in our culture generally, and they're in utter extreme version in the world of incels.
It seems kind of paradoxical though, right? Because while one interpretation is that it's these patriarchal norms that exist within the male subculture that is driving them to this despair. I mean, the reality is that women aren't dating them, right? I mean, presumably, I don't know, maybe 30 years ago, these guys would have gotten dates, and now they're not because, women are looking at them differently than they looked at them in the past. And
right. I mean, I think women have more choices now. I think a lot of these boys have grown up with this internalized entitlement to women. So they've been fed this message that, just by existing as a male, it's your kind of birthright to get the girl at the end of the story. And women are now being like, well, actually, I have choices. I have financial choices. I can earn my own money. Why do I want this guy? And so this is like female agency, but the men haven't caught up in the sense of like, actually, I might need to do something to get, So there's this huge sense of resentment against women. Women are terrible. And I remember I got into this ridiculous argument with this incel guy about, he has this view that women were these terrible, shallow creatures, which is kind of ironic because, I think if anyone's judging their potential partners on their looks, I think it's probably more men than women who are doing that, historically at least. But I think that they haven't caught up with this idea. And it's really complicated because there's all these sort of strange ideas, even bleeding into the mainstream. I know that Jordan Peterson has kind of clicked around this topic, which is like that at some level, the government should start like allocating women to these lonely men so that we don't have a crisis, or that, at some level, it's the women's fault, not as clearly as that. He's definitely not saying literally that, but he's like, well, we should start exploring possibilities of how we can get these, as if women are some kind of natural resource that these people are entitled to rather than human beings.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned this obsession with physical appearance. I mean, that seems to be sort of a, I don't know, projection. Is that projection? Because that's, do they think that they should be working on masculine virtues, or should they be?
Yeah,
working out?
This is the thing. It's so. I interviewed these guys, and I was conflicted all the way through because on the one hand, nobody's entitled to sex with anybody, that nobody's entitled to have someone find them attractive. That's ludicrous. But also, I think that they were operating in a really difficult culture where a lot of them had a real thing about height, that they were short and that this was something that they believed that women valued so strongly. There's nothing they could do about it. It was this kind of inevitability, and that they felt that they were being like shamed everywhere for being short, and it was so normal in the culture. And they were right. They are right in the sense that there is this like shaming of short men, and it's so normal. And I realized I recognized it in myself when I was talking to this guy. Might well talk about someone having a short man complex or whatever, and just not see it as kind of body shaming in the same way that we would if we were talking about weight or women or, but so I can see why they find this really hard. And my feeling was with this, I think there's this movement, especially with many of my feminist peers, and I consider myself a feminist very much, but I think there's this movement to like, not humanize these guys, not give them a platform, not talk to them, not listen to them, label them as terrorists. That's a big, there's this logic, which is like, if we're going to call, the Arab Muslim guy a terrorist when he shoots people, why are we not calling this lonely white guy a terrorist? So we should. And my own view on that is like, I don't think it's necessarily really helpful to call the Arab Muslim young, lonely, scared guy a terrorist either. I think that actually we would do better to have empathy for all these people and try and figure out what's going on and listen and engage and humanize and empathize, rather than going to the lowest common denominator, the kind of, throw them in jail forever. Mm-hmm. I think that we'd be better to do with more empathy for everybody rather than less for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Well, you also mentioned, right, that your boys are, they're a bit rambunctious and, playful. And there's a way in which that sort of behavior could be pathologized, right? How do you know the extent to which that behavior is indicative of some, toxic masculinity, and to what extent is that, kind of cool and
just
fun
normal
and
boyhood?
wonderful, right?
This has been one of the hardest things for me consistently because, the book came about because my third boy was born right as the Me Too movement was exploding online, right as the world was like launched into this like global reckoning with toxic masculinity. So I felt like I was doing all my parenting in the shadow of this conversation. It's boys are toxic, men are toxic. The best you can do is kind of limit the damage. So it's such a horrible filter through which to view your own children, And I happen to have very wild, very rambunctious, very delightful, but also, all of the things that all of the boys' stereotypes, they very much bought into. And they did love all the Nerf guns. They did love all the, they were wrestling all the time and often really fighting with each other, not just play fighting. And so when everything was so freighted with all this cultural baggage, is it is this just a normal thing that he wants a Nerf gun to play with his friends? Or is it a sign that he's going to become a school shooter? Or if he fights with his brother, is this toxic masculinity? Or is this just normal boyhood or just normal childhood? And I think it's really difficult. And especially, the thing we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, this idea that I am in control of everything that they do and that it's my job to turn them into these perfect feminist citizens that will behave a certain way. And it's a constant back and forth. I don't want to just shrug my shoulders and give up and be like, oh, well, that's just the way they are. But at the same time, I don't want to pathologize them into thinking there's something terrible. And I think it's a constant negotiation. I do believe that the model we talked about at the beginning of this conversation as well, about boys need slightly more parenting rather than slightly less, is a good filter, and that for that parenting to be very nurturing rather than harsher and more, trying to reform them all the time.
Right. And you talk about how maybe there are marketers that are trying to sort of get people to buy more stuff, right? I mean, it seems like there's also a sort of anxiety industrial complex out there that's, feeding some, I don't know, desire to be anxious and maybe get you insecure about your parenting, right? And I'm wondering, I mean, when your kids, when they got diagnoses for, say, ADHD and autism and so forth, I mean, isn't that also, could that potentially be veering into pathologizing what might be normal behavior at some level?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yes, in terms of this anxiety industrial complex first, I think you're absolutely right. And it's a thread that goes through both of my books, America the Anxious and BoyMom. I think in America the Anxious, I explored how this anxiety industrial complex works on the self, on this idea of internal self-improvement, the race to happiness, the wellness industry, all of that. And in BoyMom, absolutely, I'm talking about the kind of parenting industrial complex, which is the same idea, but applied to your kids. And so, yes, it's this feeling that it's all in your control. You do the right things, you'll get the right results. These aren't sort of independent humans that you're dealing with. They're sort of extensions of you. And throughout the book, I tell the story, so the book has a strong piece of memoir in it about raising my own 3 sons. And there is a sort of storyline, a thread about how we are trying to figure out if their behavior is something, if they are neurodivergent, if there is something going on that's beyond the normal, oh, boys will be boys, so rambunctious. And there's so much overlap. If you look at the diagnostic criteria for autism or ADHD, it could sound like half the stuff that people say about boys anyway. So the stories, the narratives around it are very similar. In the course of the book, we get our boys assessed and all 3 of them get diagnosed. This is in the pandemic. All 3 of them get diagnosed with mild, very mild autism, and the older 2 with ADHD. Now, since that book was written, they've all been reassessed at we got this as a sort of a freebie, if such a thing could, through the Wright Institute in Berkeley. And now they believe that these autism diagnoses are no longer valid. They don't meet the criteria. So that, but the 2 older kids, the ADHD diagnoses are still valid, and they take medication for that. The medication was, especially for my middle son, was transformative. I truly believe that this was real, that this thing helps him, that this is a real phenomenon. My older son, I think it's a little more complex. I don't know. It wasn't so clear. I don't know what to think about it. And I lean into that uncertainty in the book. I think it's very easy for us to feel in this cultural moment, not just about, neurodivergence, but about everything. There's like huge amount of moral certainty about absolutely everything. It's like, it's this or it's not this, it's boys or it's girls, it's nature or it's nurture, it's right or it's left, it's autistic or it's neurotypical. And I think things are often complicated, I don't know. And the assessment process, I think, gave us more information about our children. It gave them and us ways to understand themselves and to think about their own identity. But I wish there was a way that we could take what's valuable from that and not turn it into everything about them and their entire identity and our entire lives and, all the rest of it. Or to write it off completely and say, this is complete rubbish.
Yeah, I did a podcast with somebody who I think coined this term like type 2 autism or type 2 ADHD, right? So instead of type 1,
what's that?
In the sense, it's like, with diabetes, right? So in other words, there's something about the environment or the culture, right? which sort of, brings out these quote disorders. You talk a bit about the phone use in your household, and I've had a number of discussions with folks about phones and other kinds of environmental factors that, are changing childhood. How does one keep abreast of all these different changes? This is the introduction to the phone is probably the single biggest change in, childhood in our lifetime, right?
Yeah. For us, the literal phones probably weren't so much of an issue as screens more generally, because our kids didn't have phones. Our oldest now has a phone. He's 14, but he didn't have a phone during any of the time that I was writing this. But for them, it was video games and screen time more generally. Now, one thing that's really interesting about the whole discussion of screen time and how it's impacting teenagers, and it's a huge debate at the moment. But one thing that I'm not seeing so much of in the commentary is just what a gendered problem this is. I think we hear a lot about the impacts of these things on girls, and most of the discussion centers around like social media and self-comparison, and you see everyone else's perfect lives on social media, and then you feel terrible about your own life, like broadly. And that we sort of, the lens that we're looking at this generally as a culture is through the impact on girls. But when I sort of dug into the data on this, what I realized is that another problem with screen time is this phenomenon of displacement. So it's this idea that, you're spending time on a screen that you would otherwise be spending doing something else in real life, crucially socializing in person. So displacement of socializing. Now, this problem is a much more significant problem for boys than it is for girls. There's a ton of data on this. Boys are spending more time on screens and they're displacing more of their real life socializing into online spaces. So these kind of like large multiplayer video games and spaces like Discord are becoming the new male social spaces. And boys are socializing less and less and less every year in person, to the point where they're becoming really isolated. And this is like what we were saying about the incel movement as well. That's a very extreme example, but boys are migrating online in a way that girls are not. And I think there's lots of reasons for this, but I think in many ways, life for boys, and especially dating and romantic life, is extremely fraught in this moment in the real world for various reasons. And it's never been easier to kind of avoid it in the online world. It's so easy to just migrate online. And all of the skills of socializing and romantic engagement, dating, are really complex. They require a lot of like give and take, and they require a lot of nonverbal communication, a lot of very nuanced soft skills, which boys are generally not being taught very well in our culture. And so I think it's just easier to do this online than it is in person. And, you see this especially with sex versus porn, but you see it in regular socializing too.
Yeah, and you talked about the differences between the friendships that girls have and that boys have. And you said that the
Yeah.
friendships that the girls have are much deeper and richer than that of boys. And if that's the case, I mean, that's got to be a dramatic reversal of what had been the case, I think, historically, right? I mean, the Greeks would talk about philia, right, as a uniquely male
Yeah.
type of friendship that was
Yeah.
forged in battle, right? And, through sports and
Yes.
through, the infantry and so forth. And, it was always said that, women didn't get to have this. Men had this wonderful thing. And now it seems like the reverse is true.
The
Right? Where
opposite.
the
Yeah.
men don't even
I mean,
have that.
right. I mean, I wonder if this idea, I don't know, and I'm certainly not an expert in any way on ancient Greek culture. I wonder if it's true that women didn't get to have it then. I think they probably were having it all along and men just weren't paying attention to it and didn't care about it. But I think to your point about male friendship, the kind of decline of male friendship, I think this is very real. And I talked to many boys in the course of this research. Boys of very different cultural backgrounds. And if there was one thing that I can pull out that they said consistently, it was how lonely they felt. And some of this was, boys who were genuinely really isolated, that phenomenon of the guy in his basement and whatever. But a lot of these guys had friends, they had buddies that they would hang out with, but they described those friendships as really shallow and they felt that they couldn't share their more vulnerable, weaker, more intimate parts of themselves. I remember talking to this one guy who he was very close with his twin brother, but he told me that his brother, he hadn't cried in front of his brother since he was 5 years old. They were 19 and they wouldn't cry in front of each other because he felt it would make him look weak in front of his twin. And it was just so sad, And then another pair of boys who were sharing an apartment and they hung out every night. They played video games. They talked about sports. They had fun. But they didn't know that each one of them separately was going through a period of major depression while this was happening. But they never told each other. They never supported each other through it, And they only found out later through one of their parents that this was even happening. And this is really different to how teenage girls describe their friendships. One boy that I spoke to described his friend group as a very unsupportive support system. So they were close, they hung out, but it was like he couldn't go to them with a problem. And I think teenage girls, I've seen research that people have done with girls talking about their friendships, and it's all about the intimacy. They're my go-to person. I share everything with them. They're like, one girl described her relationship with her best friend as she's like my diary, like I tell her everything, all my most intimate thoughts. And boys and men don't do that for many reasons. And I thought when I spoke to the guys that they would, that they would just be like, well, that's just the way we are. We don't want that. But that was not what they were saying at all. They were all saying, I wish I had that, but I have no idea how to go about it. And I feel so much shame in doing that. I feel like I'm going to look weak or whatever it is, unmasculine.
I mean, do you think that it makes sense anymore to even talk about, male and female virtues, right? Here's how you should live and be in the world as a man. Here's how you should live and be as a woman. I mean, should we just be saying, here's how you should live and be as a human, right? Going forward? I mean, is that
absolutely
where we're headed?
That's absolutely my preferred model. Not that I think there's anything wrong with like presenting or appearing as masculine or feminine or any of the virtues that we've traditionally associated. That's not the point. But, now I think there's all these attempts to like rehabilitate masculinity and redefine it. And it's just like, can we just like give it a rest and just allow everybody to be fully human? Stop assigning agenda to human traits and values. Every human needs, power and agency and strength and courage. And every human needs nurturing and relationships and care and those feminine coded virtues. Why are we splitting them up? And when we try to say, oh, well, actually, caregiving is masculine, what are we even doing there? I mean, at what point does it just become meaningless and we should just give up on those things altogether? At what point is it just reinforcing this idea that it's so important to be masculine that we come up with any kind of logical hack to make it work, to preserve it,
I mean, do you think that project, I mean, it could be, it's going to be very difficult to do that in a world where, there's different expectations that we have of men and women, right? So, men, if they want
I think
to,
it's
if they want to get married and have children, they have to appeal to women, and women, if they want to get married and have children, have to appeal to men. And as long as there's different things that attract them to each other, it's going to be hard to promote sort of a unified vision of what it means to be a good human, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, and I want to be clear, I think I've talked about this, and if anything that I've ever talked about in my work has provoked a response, like an angry response from people, it's this idea that we should stop trying to, push this positive masculinity framework. And it's not because, I think it's great if people present as masculine, if they if they naturally like embody all those virtues, if that's who they want to be, great. There's nothing wrong with masculinity per se. It's just when we keep reinforcing it as the be all and end all of how a boy or man should be. And I think all these people, I was getting so many. I published a piece in the New York Times about it, and I got this barrage of abuse. I mean, abuse like you wouldn't believe, like unbelievable abusive messages from many from men, and and also like there was a line of it which a lot of this was like, well, you can't get a real man yourself, so no wonder you're like there was so much anxiety about this topic and so much like pent up aggression, and it felt like this feels like it's kind of confirming the problem. They felt so threatened by this idea. And so it's not that, great, be masculine, whatever, be feminine, all of these things are great. But it's just like, let's stop giving this message to young boys that their masculinity lies in their, that their worth. Sorry. Let's stop giving the message to young boys that their worth lies in their masculinity.
And, your book is called BoyMom, and I think you spend most of the time thinking about how moms should approach the parenting. I mean, do you think that the role of the moms is distinct from the role of the dads? Do you think that moms play a critical role in fostering these behaviors and attitudes in their sons in particular? Helping them to develop these strengths in empathy and in interpersonal dynamics?
No, it's an interesting question. I think the reason why I chose the title BoyMom was really, this is my story. It's filtered through my lens. It's filtered through, there's this kind of inherent tension in the word BoyMom. It's got this like inbuilt like little story arc. There is this sense of like, what is it like to give birth to a child who's fundamentally unlike you in some crucial way and will be like operating in a different cultural system. And I wanted to explore that tension from a story perspective. Do I believe that a mom has a unique role that a dad can't fulfill? Or no, I believe that everything that I've written in BoyMom about parenting could equally apply to dads. It's just more, I was sort of exploring a personal and cultural story about what it means to be a mom, especially a feminist mom, to a boy in this unique cultural moment. Having said this, actually, one of the biggest, I thought, when we decided to call the book BoyMom, I thought it was kind of a risk because it was going to put off male readers, and it was a small concern, but not, I wasn't too worried about it. I was like, look, this is my story. But actually, I have so many men, I'm really surprised, but so many men have read this book. And so many men, some of them are parents, dads, and some of them don't even have children. And they're just reading this in terms of their own childhood, their own experience of being a boy. And I've had really wonderful and beautiful, very touching messages from men who've been like, I read this book and I feel very seen. All these things that I recognize in my own childhood that I could never quite articulate, that I didn't feel able to talk about, that I didn't feel like cultural permission to talk about. And so I've been really very touched by that actually, and a lot of men saying, I had a man write to me the other day saying, it's transformed my relationship with my son. I felt very held back by all this like masculinity, buddy wrestling stuff. And I read this and I was like, oh, I see the importance of this kind of more nurturing, caregiving, emotionally intelligent kind of way to form a relationship. And he's been trying it with his son. And he's like, it's been transformative for both of us, And so I think, no, great, dads should be doing this too. Not to say that they shouldn't also be doing all the other like traditionally dad stuff. That's great too. But just, yeah, I think it's for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like parenting is one of those things that for most of human history, there was no science around it. Nobody really asked any questions about it. You just kind of did what everybody else did.
Just kind of did it, yeah.
Right? And it's only in recent times that people have had to try to figure out, like, hey, what do I do? Right? You can't just look around you. You have to kind of go and read books, right? And that makes it, I guess...
And we're doing it in... Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, it makes it much more difficult, right?
Yeah. I mean, you can drive yourself crazy with all this stuff. And it's like, I think we're all, or many of us are doing this kind of in isolation. So, in years gone by, we would have seen our moms and our siblings and our communities, parenting, and it would have just been a lot more kind of natural, just something that kind of naturally happened. And I think a lot of us are in our nuclear families in isolation with zero social support, trying to figure out how to do this really hard, very meaningful, but very challenging thing on our own. And I think, that coupled with the expectations that you're going to be a professional psychologist and a professional sports coach and an academic, support and this and that, the expectations on modern parents are bananas, and the guilt associated with it can take a lot of the joy out of the process, I think.
Well, I mean, do you think we should have professional training, right? I mean, if you want to be a dentist, you got to get whatever 8 years of education, and we can become parents without any training at all, right? It's kind of nuts.
It's so true. And you can do so much more damage than you can probably do with your dentist drill, psychological damage to a child. And and I think maybe for moms especially, because I know my husband doesn't carry around the same level of like expectation and guilt that I do. Mm-hmm. I think it's kind of double points, half effort for him. Like he shows up and everyone says he's a wonderful dad, whereas the expectations on moms are insane. You really have to be doing it at this extremely intense level, and everything that you don't do is a failure. And so I think that is something very real in the culture. But yeah, I mean, I think I probably would have benefited from a PhD in parenting, but obviously that would obviously be terrible if that were the case. So,
yeah. Well, maybe one day that'll be a major available to you in university. But anyway,
probably.
The book is called BoyMom. And of course, don't forget the America the Anxious, which hopefully is still in print because it's still a fun book. Appreciate it.
It is still in print, yeah.
So thanks for joining me. We'll talk again soon.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.